Teachers, what's the worst fight you had to break up? I taught for 2 years in a very rough boys' school where I had to break up fights almost daily. Here are three stories from that time. The first fight was between two grade 9 students, though I can't quite remember the cause. It might have started as an argument about whose mother was poor or who owed whom money. It took 4 staff members to separate them initially and even more to keep them apart afterward. I'm pretty sure they met up outside school to settle their differences later that week. The second story is a bit more lighthearted. In my first few months of teaching at the school, I rewarded a group for good behavior by taking them to play soccer on their small hardcourt area. And when I say good behavior, I mean they hadn't said harsh words to each other in my class all week. Even though I was still new, I felt like I could trust them since they had been relatively well behaved, and they were a small group. In the middle of the game, which was going great, 2 players from opposite teams had a moment of frustration, and by the time I was able to get between them, it was over. We took a 5 minute break, they shook hands, and we continued the game. I didn't write them up for that one. The last story is one of the few times where I legitimately thought I would have to defend myself. I was on duty at the hard court during break and asked a student about his behavior. He had been picking on a younger student, and all I had asked was for him to stop. When he kept doing it, I approached and told him that he had to leave the hardcourt area. Once I was within 5 meters or so, he turned on me. Everything seemed to slow down as he started to walk towards me. At the same time, I could sense the other students watching and starting to move closer. I began stepping back while talking to him, trying to de escalate the situation, and I even outstretched my arm to keep space between us. Before the student could reach me, he was turned and escorted away by 3 other students. As bad as that situation was, it had a silver lining. Even though they all had their differences with me at times, that day, I felt lucky to have those boys as my students. I'm not sure what would have happened if they hadn't stepped in, but I know it wouldn't have been a positive outcome. Man, those first few years of teaching can really throw you into the deep end. Kudos to the OP for sticking it out and handling all those crazy situations, because that first fight sounds pretty intense. And that last story is wild too. Glad to hear those other students stepped in when things got heated. Sometimes I guess the toughest kids can surprise you with their sense of solidarity, eh? Story 2. My first year of teaching, I had to break up a bunch of typical middle school fights. We had a bit of a mob problem, so it was fairly common. 2 incidents really stand out to me, though. The first involved 2 girls fighting over a boy who had been sent to juvie. I walked out of a classroom where I was observing, and one girl was already being held back by our 7-foot-tall social studies teacher. The other girl was screaming, "He's my man, get out of my hall!" The screaming girl was one of my students, so I walked over, calmly asked her to let go or be picked up, and ended up carrying her to the office while she was screaming. At one point, she promised to calm down, and I fell for it. She immediately ran back, so I had to carry her to the office. Later, they asked if I wanted to press charges for what she did. I literally laughed in the deputy's face, like, how absurd are people that they have to ask you if you want to ruin a 12-year-old's life? There was one incident even worse than that. I had a student who was rumored to be a mob leader, but he was always respectful with me and worked hard in class, so I just chalked it up to rumors. One day, near the end of the year, I turned around to write something on the board and heard a girl scream. I turned back to see the quiet, respectful kid had pulled one of my loudmouths out of his seat and was hurting him, yelling, "Think you're gonna jump me and one of my boys? No way." I was horrified. This kid was a weightlifter, and getting him off the other kid was like nearly impossible. Once I did get him off, I screamed at the other kid to get the next door teacher. Being the antagonizing kid he was, he stood there and taunted the leader. The leader escaped and chased the other student around the school screaming. It took me like 5 minutes of chasing them through the halls with the other teacher watching my classroom to get admin or the deputy to help. It was then that I decided not to teach middle school anymore. I teach high school now and see my old 7th graders a lot, including the troublesomes. One even apologized to me. Most of them want me to teach them when they reach the grade I teach. I just really hope they've chilled out with time. Story 3. I'm a preschool teacher, and I'm currently dealing with a very troubled child we will call Tyler. So he's 4, and my classroom has kids from 3 to 5. Let me share a few incidents from just this week. During circle time, Tyler just cannot sit still. He climbs over other kids, treating them like toys. There's this little 3-year-old girl, Mia, and Tyler was pulling on her leg. I asked him calmly to sit on my lap, knowing he'd start throwing tantrums if he felt he was in trouble. So I picked up Mia and put her on my lap instead. This upset Tyler, and with a blank expression, he started hurting Mia, making her scream. Even with his arms restrained, he lunged at Mia like a troublemaker, his face completely blank. Another incident also involved Mia. They were playing with Legos when Tyler broke Mia's creation, so Mia broke Tyler's in return. Tyler's response was to hurt her. Another teacher, filling in for my co teacher, grabbed Tyler from Mia and he threw a Lego at her. That teacher went to our director in tears. She said we needed to involve the parents, but the director didn't want to lose a student, so her hands were tied. The teacher then called her husband, panicking and asked to be picked up from work. She left quickly. The director took Tyler into her office, likely to talk with him and calm him down. But when I peeked in, chairs were on the floor and papers were everywhere. Tyler came back into the room after helping the director prepare lunch, and all the kids turned their heads, eyes wide with fear. We all had plain rice for lunch, but Tyler had some cheese on his. Obviously, the director wanted to reward this behavior. I told the director that Tyler wasn't allowed in my classroom for the rest of the day because the kids were crying out of fear. I insisted we call his parents to get him picked up. The director refused, saying she didn't want Tyler to act out knowing he could go home. I thought, why did you put cheese on his rice then? I told her he could stay with her for the day because my kids were simply not safe. Of course, Tyler spent the rest of the day in our room because the director had a meeting, but I kept him separate from the class. At nap time, Ben had his mat set up next to Tyler's, and Ben broke into tears saying he was scared to sleep next to him. This broke my heart. I went to the director's boss and expressed my fear along with my kids' fear for our safety. He sent someone to talk to our director who was now working on a behavior plan that should have been put into place a month ago. But hey, baby steps, I guess. Story 4. I had a 50-something-year-old female student, Karen, pushing a 20-year-old female student, Emily, in my lab. So years ago, Karen had staged a fall on campus, claiming fake injuries and won a settlement against the school. Many years later, she re-enrolled. She had disability services due to her fabricated injuries, which included note-taking. Another student was paid to take notes for her. Emily, a friend of the note-taker, observed that campus policy required notes only when Karen was present in class. They brought the issue to me. I advised the note-taker to take notes but not share them unless Karen was present that day. Karen was livid and directed her vengeance towards Emily. In the lab, she pushed and cornered Emily. Students and my TA intervened, allowing the note-taker and Emily to escape. I was coming down the stairwell from the printer upstairs when Emily and the note-taker rushed up to me. In hurried breaths, they explained the situation as we raced back up. We exited the stairwell and I barged into the department chair's office. The students ran inside while I pulled my clueless chairman out of his office. I flipped the lock and shut the door. At that moment, Karen burst from the stairwell, having evaded my TA's interference attempts. The chairman and I retreated from Karen down the hall and into my office, though we didn't have time to shut the door. Karen burst in and said harsh words to the both of us. The chairman repeatedly demanded she leave or he would call university police. After many minutes, she backed out enough for us to close the door and we called university police. In the end, the university took no action against her, likely out of fear of another lawsuit. I had to finish half the semester with both Karen and Emily in my class. The dean of student affairs ordered Karen to sit 10 feet away from Emily and the note-taker. I was the one left to enforce this chaotic situation. Naturally, Karen moved closer every day. For the first week, I had a university police officer stand at the back of my class. Later, I added university police on speed dial on my phone and had to use it once. Did I mention I was only a graduate student? Thanks to the university for the support. Fast forward, Karen graduated. Every professor gave her a C- just so she wouldn't repeat their course. While I wished to fail her to prevent her graduation, she earned her C- in my course. Although the university did nothing about her, university police are state troopers, and state troopers don't take things lightly. I encouraged Emily to press charges, and she did. Karen moved away to another state and had to attend a hearing via Skype. She was reprimanded by a judge and given fines and community service. The note-taker and Emily attended the trial and shared every detail with me afterward. Did Karen think that college was like kindergarten? 'Cause man, she just had it coming. Story 5. Y'all want a Title I school story? 'Cause you're about to get one. I teach at an urban high school in the South. Having grown up attending one in Atlanta, I've seen my fair share of crazy stuff. So it's the third period, lunchtime. My classes have an awkward second lunch. After shoveling down a ravioli during my 20-minute break, I stand outside my classroom with the door open to guide kids back in. I also help with hallway duty because leaving admins to handle that many students at once is a guaranteed disaster. At 11:40, I hear the stampede of the teenagers rushing back towards A Hall with full bellies. They've got like 5 minutes to get back to class. I greet a few passing students, making sure to grab students from being late for walking their girlfriends to class. Then I hear Mr. Harris, our dean of students, called one of my students. Hey, you, come here. He can be very nice and caring person, but he's also ex-military and knows how to get loud and intense at the drop of a hat. I realized Mr. Harris saw a student with a Rest in Peace necklace. Organizations in our area have members wear these to commemorate fallen comrades. They're banned on campus, but students sneak them in under their shirts, in their pockets, or in their bags to flaunt their affiliations. Another student from an organization noticed this and took offense. Now I hear full on shouting and a commotion. Oh no, here we go. I rush over to see a crowd of 5 students in a mess, 3 guys and 2 girls. Mr. Harris is already in the thick of it trying to separate the guys, and I see 2 other teachers making their way over. I dive into the fray and unfortunately end up between the 2 girls. These were your 2 stereotypical tough girls with claws like Wolverine. I position myself between them. Now I'm a big guy, big boned, so I cover a lot of ground. Amidst the chaos, I hear some colorful insults thrown my way. Move, big guy. Get out of the way, Tubby. I hear shouts as more adults arrive, but things escalate. As Mr. Harris pulls one boy away, the other 2 turn and go after the girl on the opposite side of the chaos. There was no honor in this brawl. They pile in, causing a domino effect, and suddenly we're all on the ground. As I scramble up, our school resource officer arrives. Mr. Harris detains one of the boys. With more teachers than students now, we finally gain control. It was a whirlwind, all over in just a few minutes. And then we move into damage control. Teachers who weren't involved stopped anyone from leaving. We demand all phones be turned in as evidence. Having phones out during school violates policy, so they had to hand them over. I'm sure there were arguments, but I wasn't part of that. We collected about 70 phones, and students must come with their parents to unlock them and prove they don't have the fight saved before we return the devices. It's not foolproof, but it helps. I'm sure there's a video out there, I just hope it's not circulating. Thankfully, a coworker covered my class while I was in the middle of it. I stayed until just after 5 that evening, school ends at 2, to handle paperwork and make a police statement given the organizational nature of the incident. One positive thing, though, Mr. Harris took everyone who helped him out for drinks after work that day. He's always intense, but it was nice to share a moment with him after the worst fight I've seen in my career. Welcome to Title I education. These stories just keep getting crazier and crazier, and we're only halfway through. So if you're enjoying the video, please don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this in the future. Now back to the stories. Story 6. I used to teach middle school health and PE in a suburb southwest of Houston from 2009 to 2011. The district had a decent SPED program, but there was one student who stood out. He was developmentally challenged, unable to speak, but could yell and shout when frustrated. At 16 years old and 6 foot 3 inches tall, weighing at least 230 pounds, he was a formidable presence. One day during our common off period in the gym, this student, accompanied by his caregiver, was hooping free throws. He was remarkably good at it, but got upset when the basketball got stuck between the glass and the hoop, a common occurrence. He started hurling himself out of frustration. To calm him down, they often gave him a tennis ball to throw against a cinder block wall near the court. While we were discussing sports like NBA, NFL, and English rugby, we heard the familiar sound of the tennis ball against the wall. Then, suddenly, he lost control. His shouts and wails echoed throughout the gym. The other SPED caregiver burst into the coach's office, urgently warning us that the student had knocked down another teacher. He was furious and trying to grab anyone around him. 4 of us rushed into the gym, 2 coaches who had played college football, and I, a former linebacker, found ourselves facing this giant of a young man. The situation was tense as he grabbed and threw whatever he could reach across the gym floor. Our biggest coach, weighing around 285, 295, managed to subdue him until he calmed down. It was a physical struggle to keep him from harming anyone else, but fortunately no one was seriously hurt. Later, we learned that the student had accidentally caused the injury to the teacher when trying to retrieve his stuck tennis ball. Despite the scare and the physical confrontation, we understood his frustration and worked to ensure everyone's safety in such challenging moments. It was a terrifying experience, but it taught us a lot about handling volatile situations in a school setting. This experience emphasizes the importance of having a well prepared and supportive team when dealing with students with special needs, especially in moments of crisis. Story 7. I taught at a comprehensive school where many students were on their last chance before expulsion. It was a tough environment, and as a new teacher, I faced a lot of personal disrespect. My classroom was egged, students lied to the admin about me, and there was constant yelling and screaming. It wasn't the right place for me looking back. The worst incident I had to deal with wasn't a typical fight. It involved one of the troublemakers in my class taunting a recent student who struggled with English. It wasn't the most violent encounter, but it was deeply disturbing. The instigator, a male student, grabbed a wooden staff used to open high windows and began using it at another student. I'm not proud of what happened next. I snapped. In a moment of rage, I grabbed the student from behind and threatened him in a way that I regret to this day. He was a troubled kid with a history of bad environment and disciplinary issues. It was an unfair and irrational reaction on my part. I was a 5'7" 180-pound male, and he was just a 14-year-old, much smaller than me. My rage was overwhelming, and I remember warning him through clenched teeth that I would face the consequences later, but would not tolerate his behavior towards the other student. Somehow, my outburst led to a 2-week stress leave. I believe some of my students defended my actions, both in that class and others. Despite the students' behavior, there were many others whom I deeply cared for. They started off hating school, but eventually trusted me enough to improve their grades and consider further education. Eventually, I made the tough decision to resign, leave the country, and return to Canada. My students who had grown close to me were understandably upset and didn't speak to me for a few days after I left. It was a painful goodbye. I loved teaching in Toronto, but I realized it wasn't a career I could sustain long term. Story 8. The most absurd fight I ever had to break up at my middle school wasn't dramatic at all. It was just plain lame. So picture this: 2 kids arguing over a pencil. One claimed the other broke it, and suddenly they were yapping like grumpy old men. Next thing I knew, they clumsily started wrestling, but it was more like a slow motion slapstick routine than anything serious. It was so awkward to watch because neither of them had a clue about wrestling. Luckily, I stepped in, told them to knock it off, and sent them straight to the office without further incident. What made it even more pathetic was that none of the other students even noticed. They were just too busy with their work and chatting away to pay any attention. Usually, you'd expect a big commotion with kids chanting, "Fight, fight, fight," and everyone rushing to film it for some viral video, but this was just, middle school drama at its finest. Story 9. I taught adults at a vocational school, mostly from rough neighborhoods. We had been warned to never try to break up a fight, as many of these students carried weapons and so forth. So one woman had a bad falling out with her group of friends and was sitting separated from them. They were talking back and forth, very loudly, very aggressively, across the room. I couldn't control them, so I went to get a supervisor. With both of us there, one of the girls from the group charged across the room at the odd one out. She was big, 6 feet, 250 pounds, while the other was maybe, 5'2"? The supervisor got in between them. They fought around him for a second, then a smaller woman injured the bigger one's face. That pretty much ended it, other than a few thrown things, but a lot of hair and braids were ripped out. The supervisor was lucky. They literally fought around him, and we called the police. They show up 45 minutes later. The cop who came in looked at us and said, "You called us about this?" We were stunned. Ultimately, no charges were filed. This happened on a Tuesday, and they were supposed to graduate on Thursday. They were not allowed back on the grounds, but each one showed up with a friend the next day. Amazing as it may seem, yes, they both graduated. This was a vocational school where they got a certificate after completing their 9-month or so curriculum. Story 10. I'm not a teacher, but I've worked in K through 12 IT for 10 years, so I've been in a lot of classrooms. Teachers aren't supposed to break up fights and often get hurt trying to do so. That being said, the worst fight I saw was in a science lab. I was in the back of the lab installing some software to go with a digital microscope, and a large 8th grade girl was disrespectfully singing while the teacher was talking. A tiny 8th grade girl behind her was getting really upset and telling her to quiet down because she couldn't hear the teacher. The big girl continued singing. The tiny girl said, "Quiet, I'm trying to learn," for the last time, then leaped over the lab table between them and grabbed the big girl's hair. They had to bring in a very large male administrator to pull her off. The teacher got hurt in the face when she tried to step in and ran out into the hall to get an admin. Fun times indeed. Alright, so if you like these stories, here's a few more. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video, and thanks for watching with me on this one.